Human resources, human capital, people and culture. This single vocation has many names. HR professionals are responsible for what is arguably the most critical success factor within any organization. It's talent. HR Studio Podcast brings you interviews from HR and industry thought leaders so you can listen, learn and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates. To learn more about our sponsor, please visit ajoconnor.com and be sure to check out the AJO blog for additional HR learning tools and resources.
So welcome everyone to HR Studio Podcast. I'm Fred Buncer, your host for today's episode. We're excited to have with us today Sara Canaday, who is a leadership expert, a consultant who does keynotes. She's a workshop deliverer, facilitator of workshops, and an executive coach. Her work is centered primarily in the areas of leadership and executive presence, a huge area of impact for people in their careers. And we thought she would have a great message for our rising HR leader audience and our leaders in general. So I just wanted to welcome you today, Sara, to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. You're hailing from, Austin, Texas, right?
That is correct.
Excellent. I don't hear an accent, so you've worked well on that, I suppose. Sara, tell us a little bit about the kind of work you do with both rising leaders and people who are, at the top of organizations.
Certainly. So I spend a good amount of my time these days working with some Fortune 500 companies and their high potential programs, or as some call them, their rotation programs. And usually these are mid-level high risers who have been identified as the next generation of leaders for the company. And companies have wanted to invest time and energy in developing these emerging leaders. And so I get to come in and, work with groups or cohorts, as some of you know them, that are already high performers, already interested in getting to the next level and are eager and ready to sort of tackle new challenges, be more innovative, and discover hacks for how to perform at a higher level.
Okay. And as you think about the people that you normally see showing up in those programs across various companies, I imagine there's some really classic attributes that designated hypos would share. But I'm wondering also if you can let us in on what are some of the other things that you see those people having in common that may not be so naturally obvious.
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the challenges for companies and for HR professionals who either are managing these programs or involved in managing these programs is that these high potentials do have somewhat of a unique characteristics. They want to be challenged, but they have expectations when they go into these programs, right? They are hungry to learn, to be exposed to more information, to be exposed to senior leaders, to be on cross-functional and global projects. And at the same time, they have expectations for where this new and more in-depth involvement will take them. And I think the other mistake sometimes we make is that we assume that just because they are high potentials or high performers, we just give them more work. And so giving them more work is not necessarily the answer. Giving them time to assimilate and practice what I call sense making around that work is what's really important. But by and large, your original question is, what are the characteristics? They are learning agile. That is probably the number one thing that I find. And they are pretty resistant to change. And I say that because I have experience with people in rotation groups, and they're often put from one business unit to another where they use they used to be the subject matter expert, and now they're no longer the subject matter expert, and they're pretty resilient in wanting to just consume as much information as possible and then try to make an impact. So learning agile, resilient, I think their perspectives are usually a little bit broader, again, because they're hungry for information. So they're usually a little bit broader in their knowledge and perspective. And I think the other one I would say is they're resourceful.
Okay.
So they tend to be the people at the organization who can figure out where to go, who to contact for information.
So they've been on the front lines, they've worked their way up, and they know how to get things done and who to call for what, probably.
That's exactly right.
Now, Sara, did you say that they were a little resistant to change?
No, resilient.
Okay.
So I think they are actually much less resistant to change.
Okay. And have you seen any mistakes? You said one mistake organizations have sometimes committed with these folks is just giving them more work. They get punished for their success by getting more work. Is there anything else that you've seen that will typically be a miss for people running those kinds of programs?
Yes. I think it starts with the selection process. And I've seen a lot of companies that will source their high potential program by asking leaders for nominees. And my belief is that high potentials and high performers should be able to self-select and put their name in the hat. And I say that because I think that there is, I hate to use this word because it's been overused, but there's an unconscious bias when you ask leaders for nominations.
Okay.
And I think there are probably a lot more high potentials in the room than we know about. And so if we allow emerging leaders to put their name in a hat, I think that's much preferable than having senior leaders nominate high potentials. So I think that's where it starts.
Interesting. And then what's the culling process for the names in the hat?
So then I think it becomes very similar at that level, whether you're having them nominated or they self-select. I think the interview process is critical. I think they should be interviewed. I think with an emphasis on really understanding why the person wants to be in the program, because that to me is critical. And their capabilities, trying to get a sense of even where they are in their development, what kinds of things would help them as they move through the program, how it's going to work to be in the program given their current situation, if indeed they stay in their current role and participate in some high potential program on the side, who will take on their work, how will their boss support their being pulled in two different directions at times, that sort of thing.
Okay.
So just a real, coming at it from a lot of different angles so that you understand why they're doing it, that they have the support of their leader, that they're in a position to delegate some of the work if need be, to take full part in this heavily invested program, that sort of thing.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is have you put on your coaching hat for a moment.
Sure.
And as you think about it, I know in your book, released a few years ago, according to them, you talk about some of the hidden gaps between what hypos like those and I guess all leaders, it wouldn't be just hypos, but all leaders, how they see themselves versus how others around them see them. Can you give us some examples from your own experience of either these programs or people that you've coached where there's been a bit of a gap there?
Certainly. I like to start the example with my own. I was a leader myself. I was in corporate for 15 years. And when I speak at events, I usually start with a story about how I was reminded of my own blind spot very early on in my leadership career. And even though it was sort of a tough to handle and hard to take comment or experience, it was a gift for me because it made me realize how I was being perceived, and it was something that I didn't want. And really at the time, I was very serious about my career, as so many people are, and I was under the impression that to be taken seriously by others, that I had to operate on a very focused and serious level. And you can imagine, as a leader, that didn't necessarily make me the most approachable at all times. When I went to meetings, I was all business, little chit chat. I was very focused, head down. It was about transactions. It was about results. And what I discovered is that was interpreted by others as taking myself too seriously, and as perhaps being more concerned about my own trajectory than the impact that my work had on others. And nothing could have been further from the truth. I really was honestly a caring leader, but I was also a very, I would say, even sort of traditional in my bias for action, in my results trumping everything else, in no mistakes, no risk taking, that sort of thing. And so, yeah, I always start with my own.
Sure. It's the lesson we all are the most apt to learn from and do things differently, therefore.
Sure. So, what's interesting is I see sort of a play on that same blind spot in coaching others today. And they may not be the most serious person in the room, but I will tell you, because I do end up coaching some pretty, high achievers, their focus and their drive can sometimes get in the way of others seeing them as relationship builders, as somebody who is concerned about collaborating, as somebody who makes decisions based on the broader good of a team versus their own benefit. So that particular blind spot has a lot of tentacles, and I see it every day as I coach leaders. And again, it's an unintended consequence of being focused and driven, but one that nevertheless can get in the way.
And talk a little bit about it getting in the way. I mean, it's at what level of the organization do those skills start to, or the lack of those skills start to really become troublesome?
I think probably mid-management is where it gets really troublesome. And I say that because we all know that as individual contributors, it is about production a lot of the time. It is about results. It is about metrics and key performance indicators. And even early entry-level supervisory team leader, you are usually doing some of the work. You still have some sort of a goal of your own, metrics of your own in terms of production, and then also facilitating the workload of the team. So where it really starts to rear its head is mid-management, where now it's a lot less about doing the work yourself and getting the work done through and with others. And that's the point at which people need to know you care about them as much as you do the work.
And it sounds like, Sara, that it's not simply internally caring about them, but as you said, in your own situation, you did have a care, it just wasn't expressed or demonstrated.
That's correct.
Okay. And so as you think about, so let's think about some coaching advice for our audience, because I think a lot of them are in that mode of what you've just described. They're rising through the organization. They're moving from being primarily evaluated by what they get done, now more so to how they influence, how they collaborate, how they work in a leadership role where there's less direct control. So what are some examples of ways people can demonstrate that kind of concern and caring, or what I would call low self-orientation?
It's funny. I think the typical answer for that is this idea of, caring about individuals, being at the coffee break room, asking about their son's baseball game or their daughter's lacrosse game, and getting to know them on a personal level. I think that's, we typically hear that as advice. And yes, that goes a long way. But I think the other things that are less obvious that managers tend to overlook, and I think it's because the challenge of time, is that your team really wants to know more about the why behind certain things. So it's about taking a little bit more time to give them information to connect the dots for them, and then even share your rationale behind why you're making certain decisions. It makes them feel part of the conversation and engaged. And similarly so, even as a leader or manager, even if you know where you're going or you know a solution to a problem, I still encourage leaders to ask for feedback. And I'm not, suggesting this is completely gratuitous or that they do this in a manipulative way. But again, even if you're confident that the end result might be the same, it really makes a statement when you go and you ask your team for their input. And again, I think the leaders, the reason they don't do those things is not because they don't care or they don't want people's opinion. Everything becomes about time.
Right. There's a trade-off, sure.
There's a trade-off. But my point is that it may take you more time up front, but the investment will pay off over time.
Yep. It seems to me, too, there's a corollary benefit in that not only do you engage with them and allow them to speak into or at least wrestle with the business issue, but it also gives the leader an ability to assess how their people think and what level of thought they have around the organization, around the business issues. So it's a way to do some checking in on their own insights to the organization.
Correct. And I mean, I think the last thing is one that for those in your HR community know full well. I think the last piece, and one that, when I reflect back on my role as a leader, I wish I had done more of, which is to make them feel that you care about their professional growth. What is their next step? How could you use them even currently so that you are providing more of a challenge or using their strengths or making sure that they have some passion around what it is they're doing around the work as well.
Mm-hmm. So tapping into that, understanding what it is, and then trying to tap into it where you can.
Right.
That's great. Sara, as we begin to wrap up, just tell us about what's coming up for you. Projects you're going to be working on, or workshops, things like that. I know you're beginning to work on in your next book. What's exciting for you in 2018?
Yes, the book is certainly one of those things, and it has really, blown up and flowered into this really nice book of how leaders today are somewhat different than they were even a decade ago. And the learnings that I've had, not just from research, but from working with plenty of leaders, either one-on-one or when I'm speaking at an engagement and I'm, able to interact with them afterwards. And I think there's some counterintuitive practices that I'm going to be revealing in this book that are very exciting for me, that are going to work for leaders of this decade. Again, I can put these in terms of what I wish I knew when I was a leader, but I think that some of the things I did then worked because of the times. These are some things that are going to be more counterintuitive for leaders, but nevertheless are going to serve them very well. So I'm very excited about that. So this year, I'm also continuing my partnership with LinkedIn Learning and lynda.com. And they are a clearinghouse and an aggregated site for very robust online learning. They have over 7,000 courses.
Wow.
And I am fortunate enough to author courses on leadership for them. And I have about 8 courses on their site now, and I have 4 more coming up this year. So that's something that continues to keep me primed and busy. And of course, keynotes and workshops for organizations and associations.
That's awesome. So as we wrap up, I'm just thinking about, your prior work experience, your experience with the National Speakers Association, for the Center for Creative Leadership, for the books that you've written, all the organizations that you've worked in. If you think about our audience of rising next-gen HR leaders, is there one thing, I'm going to ask you to boil the ocean here, but just one thing that you think in 2018 they should consider doing differently or thinking differently about that could open up new possibilities for them?
If you'll allow me, I think I'd want to share 2 things.
Okay.
One is to consider slowing down to speed up.
Slowing down to speed up. Okay.
Yes.
Say a little more.
To have the wherewithal to take strategic pauses throughout either their day or even in their week. We have such a bias for action. And this is one of those things that I reflect on in my career in corporate. And I think that what we need today, because of the information that's coming at us and because innovation is so critical, we really need pauses. We need times to assimilate what we know, to connect dots that are seemingly disconnected, and to let things play out a little bit more before we move to action.
Okay, that's good. Hard to do, but words of wisdom.
Exactly.
And was there a second one?
Well, and the other one I think might help us with the first, and that is to reflect on your work habits, reflect on the duties and the reports and the projects that you do. Look at everything you do and ask yourself, why am I doing this? What is it serving me or those I lead? And should I really be continuing to do these?
So a bit of a step back and a reassess of all the activity I do, what's actually bringing value.
Exactly.
That's excellent. Excellent. Well, Sara, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insights. We look forward to kind of seeing your book and the other activities, the other events that you're going to be doing this year. We're going to be connecting our podcast subscribers. If you're interested in seeing where Sara is out and about this year, we'll be able to put her social media contacts into our post. So please, if you're not a podcast subscriber to the AJO HR Studio podcast, please head on to our website and sign up. And Sara, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Great. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. To download the show notes and discover additional information from this week's episode, please visit hrstudiopodcast.com. To join the conversation, we invite you to visit our LinkedIn group, where you will connect with a growing community of current and future HR leaders.